Welcome to the LSI Behind the Win podcast. I'm Lauren Lane. For 50 years now, the LSI team has dedicated themselves to the science of business development. We've seen the impact of our work and how it's evolved into economic development and now social impact work. This week, Sean is joined by Mr. Andy Napoli, Assistant for Stationing and Base Realignment and Closure, which is also known as BRAC, at the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army. They're going to discuss the future of Army installations and what communities can do and what they need to know about installations coming or leaving their communities. It's an intense topic, but we're so glad Mr. Napoli is here to discuss it with us. So, without further ado, let's dive in.
So, Andy, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon and agreeing to spend some time with us. You've had such a long history in your career working with military installations. As you and I have talked about, we are working with a lot of communities that have defense installations, helping them with strategy and whatnot. And so I've really been looking forward to this conversation with you. Before we start, and I've got a number of questions for you, but before we start, could you just talk about your history with the Department of Defense and especially this current assignment that you've had for a long time, Assistant for Base Realignment and Closure for the U.S. Army. Just talk about your career and how did you get into this world?
Thank you, Sean. It's kind of by accident, to be honest with you. So I worked on Capitol Hill for New Jersey Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Yes.
He has been in there for a long time. He was elected as a young man. I think he was like 27 years old when he first took his oath of office. I worked for him for almost 10 years. My portfolio evolved. I started as an intern and then worked my way up to legislative director. About halfway through my term with him, I picked up the defense portfolio, which I really enjoyed. And so it was interesting when I first started working there. His district includes a Navy base, Lakehurst Naval Air Warfare Center, and also a portion of the Fort Dix training area. And then he had a lot of the employees of nearby installations, which included Earl Naval Weapons Station and also McGuire Air Force Base. And then, of course, there's a series of National Guard and Army Reserve facilities and training areas, one in Seagirt for the Army National Guard. And so Lakehurst had just managed to get a stay of execution from the BRAC 95 round. And so when I took over, his guidance was pretty clear. Let's do things that will help us avoid getting BRAC'd the next time. And in the course of doing that, I worked on joint basing or early versions of joint basing. And I did that until 2005. And then in 2005, I had the opportunity to go work for the 2005 Base Closure and Realignment Commission, the independent commission. And that was actually in large part because of my work with Chris. He was good friends with the chairman of the commission, Tony Principi, who had been the previous VA secretary. And Congressman Smith had been the House Veterans Affairs Committee, full committee chairman. And so I got to know Secretary Principi pretty well during my time there. And so I did that for about 6 months, which was an absolute whirlwind. And my job on the commission was to be the editor of the final report to the president. So I had to create, or edit like 760 pages of material, which included doing individual write-ups on every single recommendation. As you may remember, Sean, there was like 190 plus recommendations, and each recommendation was often a bundle of separate moving parts. So just describing the recommendations was challenging. And then after I did that, I did a short stint with another commission on the National Guard and Reserve. And so we had an opportunity came up at the end of the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, for a special assistant for the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations and Environment. And I was able to pursue that. And then eventually I was able to pursue and get a civil service position in a related office in that organization. I've basically been with the headquarters Department of the Army since 2006. I've bounced around and pursued a couple different job titles within the Army, but basically, I've worked in and around installations, base realignment enclosure, stationing, sort of some alternative finance and energy related things. So I've had a pretty wide gamut of assignments and issue sets to work on over there. So and of course, part of the reason I've stayed is I really enjoy doing that kind of work. And I think my congressional background has really helped me in that regard because, I remember scheduling meetings with Department of Defense officials on the sending end, and now I'm on the receiving end of those same types of meetings. And so I kind of have a sense of like what the communities are hoping to get out of a meeting and what they're really looking for. And I try to help them, steer them to where I think, and also I try to provide them with, frank advice that if I think their ask or their request is something that is unobtainable, I try to help steer them to something. Well, I'm not sure if we can do that, but we might be able to do these three things. And if any of those three things can help you, then let's pursue those instead.
That's amazing. And it really is fascinating work. Every installation is a thumbprint and has their own strengths and challenges that is completely different. You might think that a depot is a depot. It's not. It really has unique nuances based on a lot of different things, including workforce and the environment and a lot of factors. As we had talked about, Andy, our company has been involved in installation strategy since the beginning of our company's history, dating back to 1972, and we've seen every round of BRAC. Early in my career, I was working strategy with a number of installations that included Redstone Arsenal, working with the community in Huntsville. Mm-hmm. One of perhaps the most memorable elements of my 30 years doing this was the opportunity that I had to testify before the commission on the military value of Hill Air Force Base. I was asked to be that representative by the governor of the state of Utah, and was honored to do so. And I learned so much about the commission and how military value is assessed. And it really became the genesis of LSI's work in economic development and some of the other interesting things that we've done. So I really appreciate your background, and you've had such a interesting history and career in this field, which is near and dear to my heart, just because of my history.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned it, sir, that until you actually attend one of those regional hearings, it's hard to really grasp the moral weight of what you're doing, right? I'm sure you felt it when you, and I even when I was on the commission and we traveled to a couple of locations, one of the ones I went to was, I think it was Ellsworth Air Force Base.
Yeah.
The other one we went to was, what was it? It was in North Dakota. It was a tanker base, Grand Forks. And I mean, they had like the fire department, shooting like red, white, and blue streams, over our motorcade. And they had people lining the streets, waving flags for miles as we came from the airport. I mean, it was like, they treated it with a sense of like, this could be Armageddon for our community if this didn't play out the way they wanted. And so, and of course, the other thing that I found fascinating, and again, it wasn't until I was able to be there and see it firsthand until I fully appreciated it, was the way the commission hearings were structured, where the community decided for itself who they wanted speaking on their behalf. And so, so you were the rep with their fate in their hand, right? And other communities wanted to spread it out, and they wanted to have like a panel of like 6 or 7 people. Others wanted to put the whole argument into one person's hand so they could have a coherent rather than like 7 mini speeches. And it was interesting to see how each community handled that. And where I'm headed with this is I actually used some of that history back in 2015. And I say this because we may be coming into a similar period in the Army on force structure downsizing. But as you may remember, in the 2013 and 2015 period, we came out of the Budget Control Act of 2011, and there was a lot of turbulence in the Army's force structure and end strength, where we had to reduce, I forget what the exact number, but it was like 50,000 soldiers we had to reduce, right? We were at like,
Right.
I don't know, over 500 something thousand, and we had to get down to possibly as low as 450,000. And I think we ended up settling out at about 490. And there was a lot of discussions about, well, how do we manage this process in the Army? And I had suggested to the DUSA at the time, who was Tom Hawley, who I had worked with previously he was a professional staff member who had worked closely with Secretary McHugh back when he was Congressman John McHugh. And I had suggested that, we might want to leverage sort of like a public forum type of a setup to help these communities understand the magnitude of what's at stake, but also to give them an opportunity to explain to the Army just how much their communities, how much our presence and missions meant to them, so that the Army could really hear, firsthand the magnitude of what we're considering doing, and we ended up doing 30 of those meetings. And, quite honestly, I really felt like those meetings, and I'm not the only one who feels this, those meetings really helped, I believe, turn the tide at the time on whether the Army should settle out closer to 450K for the regular Army end strength or closer to 490. And after those hearings, or we called them community listening sessions, once they had concluded, it was pretty clear there was a consensus in Congress and in the building that 490 and something closer to that was the right answer at that time. And so I think there's a lot of lessons from those BRAC processes that we can still learn from even today. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it was something you said that really kind of sparked some recollection in my mind.
I agree with that. I attended many of those meetings, and just to hear the emotion of some of these communities where the installation is the economic engine of these communities, and those communities only exist because of those installations. It's emotional to hear some of these stories, and you're right. It is key to remembering. It's not just about the mission and whatnot. It really is a big part of so many of these communities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that leads me into I think a good segue to ask you a couple of questions about what do you think, especially post-COVID, where do you think we are with the current state of our military installations? I have been to a lot of installations in the last 2 years, and I've seen a lot of the installations, especially with the administrative positions, and even software positions, that has gone virtual. Do you believe that the Department of Defense, especially the Army, has taken a position that maybe these large installations are unnecessary, or that there is at least a change in the overall strategy of these installations post-COVID?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. And I would say that there are some risks and challenges that we're trying to sort our way through. We have a couple of different strategies, which I can get into, that we've recently published,
I would love
including
that.
some implementing plans. But I would say, in short, there are challenges. For example, and this is, I think, particularly poignant with what we're seeing in Ukraine, and that is adversaries are going to threaten our installations and the surrounding communities with anti-access efforts, to include using cyber attacks, disinformation, trying to undermine the bonds of trust, using criminal activity, up through maybe even electromagnetic pulse type. There's a range of things, sort of at the low end, disinformation and erosion of trust, and at the high end, sort of more active measures like sabotage and things like that, that in the event we really had a major conflict with an adversary, whether that be Iran, China, Russia, or whoever, North Korea, that we can't take our installations as a sanctuary for granted. I mean, our adversaries know full well that if we're able to deploy the third ID out of Fort Stewart or whatever the case may be, uninterrupted. They know that we have operations plans that are predicated on certain types of scenarios, and that there's a certain amount of planning lead time that it takes to get the third ID or the 82nd Airborne Division into theater. And they're going to do whatever they can to gum that up, make things complicated, and they don't have to necessarily attack the DoD networks to do that. They could, trigger a strike amongst dock workers who have to unload the cargo, onto our ships, or they could, spoof plane tickets or whatever for chartering commercial air. There's a range of things they can do. And the other thing I was going to say is that the Army's going to have to compete for human capital. Given that unemployment, I think I just saw something that unemployment's ticking down to 3.5%, which is incredible considering how many interest rate increases that the Fed has already put in.
Exactly.
But that means, and of course, it should not be a surprise to folks who pay attention to this stuff, that the Army missed its recruiting goal for this year by a large margin.
Right.
And so we're competing for human capital and human talent in a very real way. And people have options, and COVID, I think, ties into that, because they don't call it the Great Resignation for nothing. The last thing I would say is that we have something on the order of 135 installations, 13 million acres and buildings with almost 1 billion square feet. Within that universe, surely there are opportunities to take advantage of scheduled buildings, scheduled facilities, leverage telework. I mean, granted, we're not going to make Fort Stewart or Fort Hood a virtual installation.
No, right.
But it doesn't take a lot, given that we have almost 992 million square feet across all three compos. It doesn't take a lot of remote and scheduled things to make a big difference. In other words, if we could even reclaim like 1% of that, that's 9 million square feet, right? And it costs us $10 a square foot, roughly, is what I've calculated, to run that stuff. That's $90 million a year. And that was just with 1%, if you could tap. There are opportunities.
Absolutely. And some of the major installations, what we internally refer to as the mega installations, such as Fort Belvoir, Fort Bragg, some of these installations with 100,000 workers on those bases, on those posts, many of those positions are white collar office type jobs that there is an opportunity to do something creative, maybe even, work virtually, work in some new capacity. I've been so impressed with our team over the years that they've come up with some interesting strategies, especially in working through MilCon challenges. And when our team built the concept around enhanced use lease and worked a lot of the policy tied to EULs, I thought, wow, this really is going to change what these installations may look like. It is an interesting time where we are looking at, maybe there's some positions that could be virtual, but at the same time, looking at these installations where potentially we bring commercial activity and entities into these installations to strengthen their overall mission, to embed the installations into the community itself. I mean, there are some really creative things that you and your team have done in looking at, I think internally you even call this the installation of the future.
We have an Army installation strategy that we published in December 2020. It's basically a strategic roadmap for the smart and modernized installation capabilities. And since Assistant Secretary Rachel Jacobson was sworn into office, she signed out an implementation plan for that. The installation strategy has 4 lines of effort. 1, take care of people. 2, strengthen readiness and resilience. 3, modernize and innovate. And 4, promote stewardship. And then enablers for the strategy and your data analytics and partnerships. Within the implementation plan, and I'm going to quote this here, the intended end state is modern, resilient, sustainable installations, enhancing strategic readiness in a contested multi-domain operations battle space. That's what I was talking about in terms of people attacking us from all dimensions there,
Right.
providing quality facilities, services, and support. So there's a couple of key elements into that vision. I had the honor of helping shape both the strategy and the implementation plan. I worked for a Deputy Assistant Secretary, Carla Colson. And so our office played a role amongst others in reviewing and refining both the implementation plan and the strategy. One element of the vision is that installations are supposed to eventually transition from large, centralized, unhardened infrastructure into basing solutions that are resilient and adaptive with active and passive defenses across all domains, and that they would go from facilities and infrastructure that are adaptable and multi-purpose by design, enabling them to accommodate multiple tenants, systems, and missions. And then the last piece is installations will integrate with surrounding communities and civil authorities, providing information-enabled public services and expanding Army partnerships at each echelon. So within those sort of key elements, I think there's a lot of top cover for installations and their defense community surrounding them to pursue these kinds of creative partnership structures that you were alluding to. I've been here long enough to see there were partnerships, but they were negotiated based on personalities and happenstance at the time. There wasn't really like a strong push from above to pursue these things. They were more tolerated than encouraged. Whereas the difference I see, and I could feel it, is that now there's pushing down. Hey, we want to see more of these created. Now, in the Army in particular, we have been very aggressive with this particular type of authority called an Intergovernmental Service Agreement, or IIJA. And it's essentially a non-federal acquisition regulation-based contract that we can form with local government entities to provide services, installation services that we normally provide on post, but that the community also offers. So, for example, the most common ones are animal control. Service members move all over the place. There's different rules in different communities about which types of breeds of dogs you're allowed to have in your dwellings. So if you had a pit bull in Fort A and the community you're moving to at your next permanent change of station doesn't allow pit bulls, what are you going to do? You got to do something, right? Well, unfortunately, a lot of these animals end up abandoned. And so there's a particularly pressing problem in a lot of our installations with stray animals. Well, rather than the Army trying to run its own stray animal program, why not just work and form a partnership with the local community, which they almost all have stray animal shelter type programs, and you could call them and they could take care of the animal. And the same goes for like garbage collection or a road or snow clearance,
Sure.
All the way through some more creative things like professional engineering services or master planning. There's many, many dozens of different installation services that we provide on post and that the communities typically provide off post. The Army has, I don't have the exact number, but over 100 of these IGSAs that we have inked over the last, I'd say, 8 to 10 years, and they're increasing in frequency and in scope too. Some of the earlier ones were, like I said, minor, like the animal control stuff, but now I'm starting to see taking over whole recycling programs, which is, it's a big operation. And importantly, and we can get to this later, some of these services also have infrastructure tie-ins. In other words, if you're going to operate a recycling program, you need to have collection points, you need to have a place where you can do the single stream or recycling, meaning like structures, warehouses, distribution centers where the trucks come in and out, some place to maintain the vehicles if they're plowing snow. Where are you going to stage your vehicles? Where are you going to maintain them? Where are you going to have the igloos that put the sand and the salt and the other things? If you're doing road surfacing, where are they going to store the asphalt and the gravel? All those things have infrastructure tie-ins. So there's all kinds of, I think, opportunities, and we're trying our best in the Army to take advantage of them.
Well, that's a good conduit for us to talk about some of the things that our team is working through IIJA, the infrastructure and the Investment Infrastructure and Jobs Act, or also the referred to as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Initially, when we first approached a lot of the communities and the installations about this, they really were pushing back, saying, DOD really does not have a large piece of IIJA or a play in this. And we said, whoa, no, you're wrong. It is not DoD funding, but it is funding for these communities that can work to the benefit of both the community and the installation. And as we've built these strategies with a lot of these in concert with the community and the installation, now I think that a lot of these organizations, these entities on both sides, both the municipalities, the states and municipalities, and the federal installation are seeing what a huge opportunity this is. We've gone into a lot of communities and have said, you've had challenges with transportation, and here's an opportunity to run a rail line or electric buses or other creative transportation solutions. Here's an opportunity for you to look at airport modernization, water, energy. There's so much green energy that we're seeing. In fact, we're working with an installation to think. You mentioned the resiliency and redundancy strategy of the Army and OSD. This is actually an Army installation where we are going to build a floating solar farm on the installation on a small lake.
I think Assistant Secretary Jacobson visited that, actually.
That you're exactly right. And I mean, some of these things are now the communities and the installations are saying, I get this, that this may be a Department of Transportation initiative or Department of Energy initiative, but it will benefit the installation. It's been an interesting 2 years working with the communities and the installations to get them to understand what an opportunity this is. In fact, we are working with a number of installations on things that would have never had made the priorities that are things like soil remediation off the base, clean water, and remediation on some of these PFAS plumes. That EPA has funding for these communities, and it's just. I think there's a huge opportunity right now for communities to work with the other federal agencies, pull down some of this funding, and then work with the installation leadership on what their needs are to strengthen the installations.
Well, I would say one piece of advice I've given to a lot of defense communities in terms of this bipartisan infrastructure law, but I did mention it to them on a number of occasions with this Defense Community Infrastructure Program, DCIP. But I think the same applies to BIL funds too. And that is, I strongly recommend that where we have an IGSA in place, or that we've analyzed an IGSA, but it didn't pencil out because of infrastructure amortization problems, right? So for example, like let's say for recycling, the installation has a recycling center, and then the local city or local county has one or more recycling centers. Now, if the city could take it over on post, but then the city has to send its people to the base and run the center. And then that you're really running like multiple centers. And that may not be the most efficient way to run based on the volumes and the types of wastes being distributed, disposed of, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe it's better to rethink or right size or optimize the infrastructure for the recycling centers and do 2 or 1. But to pay for that infrastructure right sizing through a 10-year IGSA agreement, that the amortization schedule may be so aggressive that it just doesn't pencil out versus what you're currently paying to run the thing on post. Right. I did a little bit of research, on the different types of categories of this bipartisan infrastructure law. And supposedly there's $275 million available for solid waste infrastructure and recycling grants. So now if a city or county could tap into that money, they could pay for the one-time infrastructure-related optimization expenditures. Then the IGSA, the Intergovernmental Support Agreement that they could sign with the installation, may now pencil out in a win-win manner, because now you're just doing the operating costs, and now you can optimize the collection routes and the sorting, the storage, all that stuff. And now the thing maybe makes sense, whereas previously it was a bridge too far. So what that does for the military is that reduces our base operating support or BOSS costs, which, as you may remember from your BRAC days, if the department ever were to get into a future BRAC-like situation, and we were looking at closing an installation or realigning it, the savings from BRAC are always calculated based in large measure on the avoided base operations support costs. So anything a community can do to shave that base operating support recurring cost down essentially is like a form of BRAC proofing, right? And it's a form of BRAC proofing that the department vigorously supports, because right now we don't have BRAC, but we do have this IGSA authority. And if we can get the savings we need to reinvest in our enterprise to do the resilience things, or to do more things with mission, we would much rather be able to do that in a way that the community supports, rather than trying to get the community to support something like BRAC, which a lot of communities don't want to do. So I would say another one, I mentioned like snow removal. That would be another one where there's an infrastructure tie-in. And if communities could use block grants, again, some of the money from the BIL, I understand, is in the form of block grants, which gives the communities a lot of flexibility. You said rail infrastructure. There's a lot of installation that has a deployable unit, particularly with equipment that's heavy, typically has a designated port of embarkation, where if they need to deploy downrange, that's where they send their heavy equipment, their tactical vehicles, generators, things like that, bulk fuel. And they send that to the port, and then the port has to get that shipped, right? Now, typically they'll fly the soldiers on a chartered airplane or military aircraft, and then they'll pull in what they call an APS set, or pre-positioned stocks. But those pre-positioned stocks, there's only so many sets of those equipment lying around in theater, right? So depending on the size of the engagement or the operations plan that they're practicing against, you still need to get some of the heavy equipment from the port to the theater. Now, it just takes longer, right? But anything we can do to identify bottlenecks or extra redundancy ahead of time that can be funded through this bipartisan that has direct benefit for the military value of the installation. And that, by the way, is a category, in fact, the most highly valued category for these DSIP grants, these Defense Community Infrastructure grants. So, I think there's tons of opportunities out there for communities and their representatives to piece together a quilt with different types of funding covering one thing, and then their own discretionary resources covering the middle. And then there's alternative finance things out there. Like for resiliency stuff, we have energy savings performance contracts we can sign. We have power purchase agreements. And again, sometimes what we find is that a certain amount of the switching gear, the microgrids that, really make these things work, it's hard to amortize those investments off of your power purchase agreement. So maybe you can use this BIL grants to pay for maybe some of the switching gears, or maybe to install a new substation, and then you pay for the microgrid through some other means. So it's really a function of like putting a puzzle together or a Lego set where you have different pieces and you're trying to fit them together into a coherent whole. So yeah, there's tons of opportunities there.
I love that. We're working with an installation in the community, and interestingly, the leadership of this community really did not have a strong relationship with the base leadership. The two just never had an opportunity to work together. And we're working a project now where we will be modernizing an old base grid. And as part of that, working to provide some additional energy to a school. And it is all of a sudden I see the community and the installation coming together and getting creative about some of these things that they hadn't previously thought about. It's a really interesting time, I think. One of the, I guess, benefits of being in this role for so long is you have seen some of the installations that were BRAC'd over the years, and some of these installations were redeveloped successfully. Some of them were not. We've worked with a lot of communities like the Sacramento community in San Antonio, and both of those regions were hit significantly hard. Sacramento, as you may remember, McClellan was the largest installation at probably 15,000 employees, but in a 10-year period of time, they also lost Mather Air Force Base, a big Army Corps of Engineer installation, and some other smaller installations. San Antonio lost Kelly Air Force Base, Brooks Air Force Base. A lot of the consolidation that went into Randolph, I think, was overlooked. But now you look back on these former installations 20 years later, 25 years later, and at McClellan, I was just there last week. There are more jobs at McClellan today than there was at the peak of the Air Force owning that installation.
It's amazing, right?
It is. I mean, it's incredible how well that installation was redeveloped. And so I've tried over the years to tell these installations and the communities, it's not necessarily the end of things. It may look different, but being prepared, and there are so many things that we've learned over the last 30 years of doing these BRAC strategies, the BRAC, working with communities on BRAC redevelopment at post-BRAC, and it's hard to think about this, but it's almost been 20 years since we've had the last BRAC.
I know.
It seems they were so painful, and it seems like, wow, that just was a few years ago. It's been almost 20 years since the last BRAC. You'd given some, you mentioned that developing these IGSA documents is a good start. Looking at some of these once-in-a-generation programs under IIJA or BIL, what other advice would you have for a community interested in ensuring that their installation remains strong?
Sure. So, and we can circle back to success stories of former installations. But to your point about the ones that are worried about the future but are still an active installation, I actually was funny you asked this question because I had just written some materials, because this question comes up a lot when I meet with these defense communities. So I just had the opportunity the other day to jot my thoughts down more coherently. And so if you bear with me here, I think I came up with about 6 or so ideas that communities could think about. So the first one, and this is a little wonky, but bear with me. The first thing, as I would say, is I think it's essential that a community, the Chamber of Commerce or whoever their key leaders are, that they get regular updates on the installation master planning activities. And in particular, they should be asking if the installation is keeping their facility occupancy and utilization data current. In the case of the Army real property management systems. And so those systems involve, there's a couple of different systems, which I won't bore you with the details of the names, but basically when the Army's looking to station a major unit or considering hosting a new organization, we rely on these foundational real property systems to develop our courses of action. And if the enterprise data in those systems is not correct, that can negatively affect their military value analysis scores, right? Now, it is true that we do make data calls to supplement. These systems are not always perfectly maintained. They're very labor intensive to keep them updated, so which is why they often go out of tolerance. But, and again, we will make data calls if it's a major stationing action. The thing is, though, if the data is really that bad, sometimes the data call doesn't completely get it right. And again, I'm not faulting the Army or any of the other services because they have similar challenges, but there's only so much you can do to fix, data that gets out of tolerance for a long time in a relatively short period of time. So making sure that you have the right data in your systems, that's something installation and just asking, well, how are we doing in that? I mean, just something very simple like that. And if the answer is, well, we're months or years behind, well, then they can start to put a little pressure, helpful pressure, right?
Sure.
That, hey, this is important to us. Like, it's not just an abstraction, because in the absence of this, it becomes an abstraction. Like, well, who cares? Only the data scientists care, right? And I'll segue very briefly for a real world example when I worked on the Hill. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention manages a program called the National Cancer Registries Program. And every hospital in the United States has what they call a tumor registrar, where basically if you have cancer and your cancer is diagnosed, there's somebody in that hospital who assembles your medical profile. They anonymize your name, but they enter in your demographics, all this kind of information, what stage of cancer, where was it diagnosed, all that kind of stuff. And then that goes into like a database that the states then submit to CDC, and researchers do pretty high-end research on that data, and includes epidemiologists to try to figure out where cancer rates are higher, where they're lower, what can we learn from those trends. And the thing is, those tumor registrars are a cost center in that hospital. They're not getting a revenue stream for every case they enter into the registrar, right? That's just covered under overhead. Well, the only people who really get upset when the data is out of tolerance is the CDC. I mean, no one cares until there's an actual problem. And then we're like, well, what does the data say? Well, we don't know. It's 5 years out of date. And that actually happened in Congressman Smith's district in Toms River, New Jersey, back in the 90s. There was an allegation that there was a cancer cluster due to an environmental exposure, which affected some of the drinking water sources. And when I pulled the thread on it, I found out that the tumor registrar data was years behind, and we really couldn't tell. And so my boss at the time, we advocated to put more money into that program and to get the states up to snuff. But it took years to get the data back to where it needed to go. And then eventually we were able to demonstrate that for certain subpopulations in Toms River, there did seem to be, a higher rate of cancer. Then they took corrective, all kinds of actions. My point is, at the installation level, the same types of dynamics are at play, right? No one cares about the occupancy data until it's time to say, hey, I'd like to compete for this mission that's coming up. Well, your time to fix that was 2 years ago or a year ago or 6 months ago. You're not going to crash. It's not like you could take your whole final if you haven't attended one class, right? So that's one thing. Second thing they can do is similarly, how are the installations and the unit commanders enforcing requirements and optimizing your facility footprint, right? It's a fact of life. Unit tenants have a tendency to spread out into every available square foot, even if they exceed their authorized square footage. And unless there's countervailing pressure to manage and optimize the footprint, when a stationing opportunity or a new mission comes up, when you consult the database, it's basically going to say there's no room at the inn. And if there's no room at the inn, that means the only way to get that mission in there is to do all new construction, which typically will run you, in the Army, at least $300 a square foot for most facility types. And that's not really even including the site prep. So it can take, sometimes tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to get even a modest sized organization to get all new facilities. I mean, in reality, there probably are existing facilities on the installation, but no one's really cracking the whip. So if the installation communities are regularly asking about, like, hey, if a mission of 200 people were to be available, like where would we want to put these people? Those are the kinds of questions that I would encourage communities to be asking. The other thing I would suggest is communities can engage with their state and federal environmental regulators to find out, what's the relationships like. As you and I have been in this business, there's a science to environmental remediation, but a lot of it's about relationships and trust. And all environmental documentation is hard, but if there's no trust between the parties, it's impossible, right? You can never get there if there's no trust. I think these communities have more clout and mediation potential than they realize.
Absolutely.
And just finding out if there's a challenge, like, well, we have this thing and it's kind of gotten sideways and there's a lot of bad blood. They can work with us to help get the relationships back to where they need to be. I mentioned the military value analysis scores, right? Those attribute scores for the Army often, not in every case, but they often capture the condition of the infrastructure. So if the infrastructure is in bad shape, that will lower your military value score for the associated attributes. And so, members of Congress that are interested in, their facility sustainment, O&M, operations and maintenance account, tends to get a lot less interest and visibility on the part of members and their communities because they don't have like a zip code associated with like a military construction program, right? People get invited to the ribbon cuttings for those things, right? But MilCon is much more rare than repair projects. And in reality, your military value scores are affected much more heavily by the condition of your overall infrastructure than they are whether you got one $50 million facility in the last 5 years. That's not going to move the needle nearly as much as members have a tendency and the community tends to think. Another thing I would suggest is, and you kind of alluded to this, there's opportunities to protect and ensure the good management of existing training areas by coordinating your off-post economic development with the installation's master planning team. The Army in particular, we have a program called the Army Compatible Use Buffer, where you basically do a partnership with an environmental organization and they'll buy a less than fee interest in property so that it doesn't get developed to its highest and best use and instead is sort of maintained in its current use, which is usually recreation or agriculture, which is generally more compatible with a lot of our higher intensity uses on the installation for training. And those types of things, that's like tending a garden, right? You can do it successfully for 20 straight years. And then if you take your eye off the ball and one housing subdevelopment pops up right at the end of the flight line, you've got a problem. Right. And then I would suggest with the DCIP, the Defense Community Infrastructure Program, there's all kinds of opportunities there to make off-post investments, which can enhance our military value or quality of life for resilience. The Army has this tool called the Community Support Value Analysis, or CSVA. And that is the Army's equivalent to the Air Force's education and family index, that I forget what they call it, but they basically measure a couple of items that the off-post community with housing and healthcare and a few other things. Education's one of them. Yeah. The Army has a similar basket of 5 attributes. We have, they're not exactly the same, but one of them is intergovernmental support agreements, IGSAs. And we basically, that attribute is simply how many IGSAs does your installation have? More is better. Now, I've heard some people criticize that. In my view, I'm a passionate advocate for that metric because it's a proxy measure for how deeply enmeshed the garrison is with the off-post community. In other words, if you have a lot of IGSAs, they don't just happen overnight. It's not like the snow falls and you wake up with a IGSA under the Christmas tree. You have to put effort, and it requires give and take between the off-post and on-post community. So if you have 10 of those and the other community's got nothing, to produce 10 IGSAs requires a tremendous, so to me, it's a good proxy measure of how closely coordinated the installation community is with the garrison. So that's like 6 or 7 different things that communities can be doing. Not every one of these things will apply to every installation, but I would say at least half of them probably apply to most communities.
That is just tremendous advice, and really so many of these elements are the basis of our 30 years of working with these communities. Let me just tell 2 quick stories. One is, it really is the tale of 2 communities. A few years ago, we convinced a state legislature, which, as far as I know, there's been very few of these programs that have happened, but this installation needed a new building. They had been told that it was likely going to be 10 to 12 years through the standard MilCon process to get this building. And we convinced the state legislature to fund a $25 million building through appropriated funding, and which the state legislature passed this bill, appropriated this funds, and gave the money to OSD specifically for this building. And the result of that, the installation now has over 1,800 individuals in this building that they could not have hired and implemented this workload without this facility. So, I mean, we could go through all of the economic impact of that. I mean, it's just tremendous. But more than anything, I saw it as a model where this state legislature thought this was the most foreign thing in the world to take state tax dollars and invest them into a federal installation for the benefit of the community and the installation. The return that they have received, not the state has received on taxes, the community has received on their economic impact, and the installation is received in fulfilling this workforce is just immense.
Oh, yeah. 1,800 people. That's huge.
1,800 new jobs tied to this installation. If we just had this installation in this facility, this building, we could put this together, and that happened. Conversely, we've watched another state, sadly, that has two very important installations within this state take a adverse position with OSD and these installations around some fairly insignificant environmental issues. And I know that this is emotional. I know that it is a challenge with most installations. We suggested to this administration, this state administration, that you might want to take an approach of, we're going to invest and help resolve this. And they dug their heels in and said, absolutely not. This is not our problem. This is not our issue. What we see now is the opposite happening, that the workload is decreasing, not surprisingly, and that this adversarial relationship that the state has taken with OSD on these environmental issues, which, I mean, the each of these installations have 5,000 to 6,000 military and civilians on these installations in remote areas of this state. Oh my goodness, they will never be able to replicate that. And the investment that the state would need to remedy this issue is significantly less than this $25 million this other state invested. I think it's interesting to watch the approach that states and municipalities take with some of these installations and the possibility of this. So your recommendations, these 7 recommendations for states and municipalities on how they can partner with the installations for the benefit of both the installation and the community it's invaluable. I really appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, that was the lesson that came through to me with those community listening sessions I was mentioning earlier. And from the ones that I attended, I was deeply moved by just how tied not just the economies, but like the whole these communities, the spirit of voluntarism. We have all volunteer military, so that voluntaristic spirit doesn't just end with their uniform. Their family members are volunteering at much higher rates than the average for PTA, for homeowners association, for Little League, scouts, the whole gamut, elected office, commissions. And a lot of these communities, they basically told us that but for the military presence there, they would not have this vibrant civic life that their communities have come to enjoy. And that builds on itself, because a lot of the service members, a lot of the retirees, when they go to a place where there's a vibrant civic life, that's the thing that they want to retire. So it's a virtuous cycle.
Andy, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Has been incredible, and your insight has been just remarkable. As we wrap this up, if you could think back over the past 25 years of you really being the leading subject matter expert on installation resilience and strategy. What is there any one specific project or policy that you think back on and really are proud of?
There's a lot, but I would say the one that has meant the most to me personally would be the Walter Reed Army Medical Center BRAC property disposal. And we would probably need to tell the whole story over beverages, but
well, let's do that sometime. I would love that. I mean, I know some of this history, and I think that's such a great story. You're right.
Yeah. But I would say for your listeners that what made it special was we have a process we go through, and the State Department had requested part of the parcel as part of the Fed-to-Fed screening, and then the local redevelopment authority, which was the District of Columbia, requested about 2/3 of the acreage. And then while we were in that process, Children's National Medical Center, which has a major presence in the DC region, was looking for clinical lab space as well as for research space, and they had outgrown their complex over on Michigan Ave. And they had budget set aside to try to address these needs. And they were looking for sites within DC because they had a tie to the local community and they wanted to keep it there. And the short story, is that we worked through, and was not easy, but we in fact worked through with all the different stakeholders a solution which gave about 13 acres of the old Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, which for interesting trivia purposes, was built in the early 50s and was designed to withstand a blast from a hydrogen bomb. The south facing of the building was reinforced with I don't know how many feet of iron rebar and concrete, no windows. It had like a specialized ventilation system so that in the event of a nuclear holocaust, the pathogens stored in this complex would not be released. And they even had it as an alternate presidential evacuation site. If you couldn't make it to that site in West Virginia, they could stash the president in the AFib bowels of it. And they even had like a movie studio where the president could record addresses to the country. I mean, talk about 1950s thinking, right? And they had like fake books and like fake library in back. It was kind of wild. But anyway, this priceless medical complex, as a result of our work to deconflict these competing desires, they've invested something on the order of $150 to $200 million into this thing. And they're doing world-class medical research. And it turns out they have some specialists there for my children, both of whom have ADHD, that I learned more about their programs. My kids go to, and in fact, last summer, I had the opportunity to take the kids to the clinic there because that's where they suggested we go for our annual checkup. And it was just a huge amount of pride in my wife, and she was just blown away at just how much investment. And if we had not done that, the alternative use for that complex was to just level it at a cost of tens of millions of dollars because it was so heavily reinforced. So not only did we get a tremendous outcome for this community, but the alternative was we avoided the needless expenditure of tens of millions of dollars that we really didn't need to spend. Like you said, BRAC, that never would have happened if it wasn't for our creative solutions, with this great outcome. And it's just been a huge win. So that's the one that really sticks with me. Because I've seen it with my own eyes, and I've seen how many families, not just mine, obviously, have benefited from the work that those guys do out there.
Absolutely. Andy, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I just enjoyed spending this time with you. And
yeah, same here. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate what you're doing for these communities, for our country. It's important work, and I really admire what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Take care now.